When Roland heard Nightingale say how there were more than 20 witches, and he might not be able to handle them all. After hearing this, he gave her an annoyed look and asked where she learned such things, telling her to focus on her studies rather than thinking about naughty stuff. Nightingale turned her head, covering her mouth, and said she was making a casual comment. Roland chuckled and said that if he had Nightingale's abilities, he would know she was lying, and it's obvious that she wanted to ask this question from the very start. Nightingale stuck out her tongue and slowly faded into the mist, saying it wasn't just her idea, she was also asked to bring it up. Before Roland could ask who put her up to it, there was a knock on the office door. It was Axe who walked in. He saluted Roland, and after a light nod, Roland asked if he understood the upcoming battle plan. Axe had heard some details from Brian but still had questions. If Roland had ordered Brian to take over his duties and stay in Greenwater Harbor to protect Lady Echo, then who is there to manage the eastern front lines? Pointing to the map, Roland tells him that Brian still lacked experience, although suitable to defend a city, not enough to command a large army, so Roland decided Axe would take charge of the east, while Roland himself would lead the western offensive. By evening, Agatha finished her day's work, tidying up her experiment notes, and asked Isabella if she had packed her things for the expedition tomorrow. Isabella replied she didn't have many clothes or belongings to bring. She then thanked Agatha for the information she shared last time. Agatha knew she was talking about what happened in Hermes. Agatha smiled, saying if it were her, she would also want to go and see whether to say goodbye or end things once and for all. However, noticing Isabella's sleeves, already washed to the point of fading, she pondered for a moment. With some time to spare, she decided to take her to the market to pick out a few new clothes. Hearing this made her a bit shy due to the kindness. She had always thought her status would make her an outcast among the witches. After a moment of hesitation, she admitted that she didn't have any money. Agatha, however, brushed it off, saying she had enough and could lend some to Isabella. Isabella lowered her head, knowing that as a redemption witch, she wouldn't receive a monthly salary like the members of the witch union. If she were to repay the money, it would take at least 5 years. Agatha reassured her, saying that compared to the centuries-long wait for the Takira witches, 5 years was a short time, wasn't it? Besides, the Divine War wouldn't end so easily, and Isabella surely didn't want to remain like this forever. Isabella didn't respond, but she looked at Agatha's outstretched hand. The setting sun shone through the window, casting a warm glow on Agatha, who smiled and asked, "What are you still hesitating about?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Under the beautiful sunset streaming through the window, she took Agatha's hand, feeling as if she had truly found redemption. During the night, Anna lay in Roland's arms, worry evident in her voice as she asked if it was really okay for her to go with him. Roland held her close, gently holding her hands, and smiled, saying that after so much preparation, it was fine to take a break. He explained that this expedition wasn't just about fighting, they also needed to spread their message. He stroked Anna's back and smiled, saying that attending banquets without a distinguished lady by his side would be difficult. Anna responded softly and buried her head in embarrassment. Roland had told her that one day, everyone in Grey Castle would know her name, and it didn't matter if she was a witch. Anna looked him in the eyes seriously, saying that no matter what the future held, she wanted to be with him. The next day, the army set out, with the biggest ship of them all, the Roland, leading the fleet. Looking out the window, Roland noticed that they were nearing Crimson Water City. He instructed Nightingale to notify the staff of a meeting. Soon, the officers gathered around a map to discuss their strategy. They noted that Crimson Water City was the largest in the central region after the old royal capital, with vast territories and many nobles. It wouldn't be as easy as forcing the Lord of Willowtown to surrender power as they had done a week ago. The captain suggested that Roland first meet with Count Delta, the Lord of Crimson Water City, to persuade him before issuing any decrees, as the nobles were somewhat aware of the army's intentions. If Delta refused to comply, then they could consider military action. Roland didn't mind using logic to persuade the nobles, but it would take too much time. He asked if there was a quicker way. Everyone looked at Roland, who marked several points on the map. He didn't want to spend too much time on this issue because there were several more cities to handle, and if they dealt with each city in the same way, it would take them months to reach Cold Wind Ridge. The captain had no immediate solution, but then Edith spoke up. She had an idea, though it might damage Roland's reputation. Roland looked at her with interest and urged her to continue. The scene shifted to a castle filled with people. A blonde nobleman looked at a letter in his hand and angrily crumpled it. Another person asked what the letter said. The blonde noble took a deep breath and handed it over for them to read. The letter stated that Roland had stripped the Lord of Willowtown of all his rights and claimed his lands. The other nobles were shocked and couldn't believe that the new king would actually do this. It was clear that Roland's goal was to revoke all their titles. However, these titles had been passed down through generations, and they were not willing to give them up easily. A red-haired noble lowered his head. It doesn't matter what they feel, and pointing out that resistance was futile. After all, even the old King Timothy and the church had been defeated. Who could stop Roland now? Furthermore, the nobles had personally seen how Roland's army had defeated the western region's forces. Their snowpowder weapons prevented the enemy's knights from even getting close. The blonde noble, arms crossed, disagreed. He believed that while Roland's snowpowder weapons were powerful, they had a weakness: they required open spaces to be effective. If they could force the battle into a confined space, the effectiveness of these weapons would be greatly reduced. Everyone turned to look at him. It became clear that his plan was to fight within the Lord's castle. He believed that when Roland arrived in Crimson Water City, he would undoubtedly stay in the castle, which couldn't hold too many people. If they could deploy their forces there in advance, the situation would become favorable for them. Another noble asked if Lord Delta had agreed to cooperate. He shook his head, explaining that Delta was too meek to resist, even with a knife to his throat. Then, with a cold smirk, he revealed that he had learned from the builders that many secret passages connected the castle to the outer city. They could disperse their men and place them in these passages ahead of time. The red-haired noble was frightened. How he knew this secret no longer mattered, because what they are planning to do is an act of treason. Even if they managed to kill Roland, his army would still crush them. The blonde noble tapped his fingers on the table, seemingly a bit annoyed. He didn't intend to kill Roland, only to capture him. As long as the new king was alive, his army wouldn't dare to do anything. Then they could use Roland as leverage and other nobles would rally to their side. He laughed, suggesting that Roland's control was limited to the western region. When the time came for a reversal, it was uncertain whether the Duke of the northern region would remain loyal to Roland. The room filled with murmurs. The nobles took a deep breath, seemingly making an important decision. One of them pointed out the potential benefits and asked what the next steps were. The blonde noble replied that they only needed to select a few trustworthy knights to follow his command. The rest just needed to wait. Looking at the sunset outside, he spoke with great confidence. Not long after, Roland's fleet arrived at the dock of Crimson Water City. All the nobles had come out early to welcome him. The blonde noble envied the massive and powerful fleet, admitting to himself that the new king's display was indeed impressive. He whispered to the guy next to him, asking if everything was ready. The other nodded, saying that 51 men had already been placed inside the castle, and in 2 more days, the rest would be sent in as well. He smirked, feeling confident that they had enough time to ensure their plan's success. The nobles quickly put on welcoming smiles as Roland disembarked. Among the crowd, Roland noticed the blonde noble, who introduced himself as Count George of Rockridge, boasting about his territory's tea and fruit wine production and inviting Roland to visit. Roland showed interest and asked about the exact location of his territory. George was a bit surprised but responded that his territory was east of Crimson Water City. Roland smiled, patted George's shoulder, and said it sounded like a beautiful place, advising him to cherish it. George's face darkened at this, and he coldly glared at Roland, thinking to himself, what is that smile? Either way, soon he wouldn't need to be so obsequious. But what did Roland mean by that comment? As night fell, a grand banquet was held in the castle. Roland and Anna, dressed in their finest, drew everyone's attention as they entered the hall. The nobles were surprised to see Roland only brought a few guards with him. One guy named Gaius approached George with 2 glasses of wine, offering him one. George thanked him and asked what was going on. Gaius glanced at Anna, noting how strikingly beautiful she was and how none of them had heard of her before. While Roland's recruitment of witches wasn't exactly a secret, George had the god's punishment stone hidden in his clothes, even if she was a witch. He didn't care much, thinking that once Roland was under his control, it would be an excellent piece of evidence against him. Deciding the witch's fate would then be up to him. Well, I'm sure everyone can already guess what's going to happen to this guy. Anyway, Gaius, clearly understanding George's thoughts, tells him to share once everything is over. They exchanged a dirty look, clinked glasses, and laughed heartily. The banquet proceeded smoothly until the fat noble Count Delta suddenly called for silence, announcing that the king had something to say. Everyone's attention was focused on Roland as he stood up. He first thanked the count for arranging the banquet and expressed his pleasure at seeing so many attendees. If he's not mistaken, nearly all the nobles from around Crimson Water City are here. Count Delta nodded, confirming that aside from 2 nobles who were absent due to health reasons, everyone was present. Roland nodded in acknowledgement and took the opportunity to speak. It's simple. From today onwards, Crimson Water City and its surrounding territories will belong to the Kingdom of Grey Castle, he declared, looking around the room. Furthermore, these lands will not be granted out again. This means that none of them will continue to hold hereditary noble titles. The room fell silent as everyone stared at him in disbelief, including George. This was not part of the plan. George had assumed that Count Delta had already discussed this with Roland, but the Count's shocked expression indicated otherwise. Delta tried to argue that the decision was too sudden, but Roland interrupted him. Roland addressed the room, stating that those who wished to move forward with him in this new era would be welcomed, while those who tried to stand in the way would be crushed into dust, as he already knew what they were up to. The Count, incredulous, asked how Roland knew about their plans. He tells everyone because he can see through people's hearts. As everyone was shocked to hear this, Edith stepped forward. She told the gathered nobles that Roland's ability was easy to prove. She suggested they repeat her words, warning that those who didn't comply would be seen as obstacles and would be crushed. Gaius stood up, calling the whole thing a farce, insisting that no one could have such an ability. George calmed him down, placing a hand on his shoulder. Edith ignored him, smiled, and began, as she read out the first sentence, "I fully support King Roland's new policies and will actively cooperate with the officials sent from the city of Neverwinter." The nobles repeated her words, some even chuckling at the absurdity. Roland scanned the room and unfortunately, not a single person in this room had spoken the truth. He said although he understood their skepticism, if he was in their shoes he would also find it hard to believe someone who had been on the borders of Grey Castle for so long. But he allowed Edith to continue. Second sentence, "I don't fully understand His Majesty's intentions, but I don't see the distribution of power as indispensable. As long as there are opportunities to increase wealth, I'm willing to try." This time, the nobles repeated the words, however, no one laughed. Out of everyone, only 4 spoke the truth. Roland commended these 4 individuals for their courage in the face of changes and revolution and excused them from the hall. The 4 nobles, somewhat bewildered, thanked Roland as they left. George, however, thought this was a complete bullshit. Those 4 were merely barons located in poor and border cities. They had nothing to lose and thus didn't care about their titles. It was laughable that such people could gain Roland's attention. But then he realized something. Perhaps these 4 had been in the scheme with Roland from the beginning. Edith's voice rang out again. Now for the third sentence, "I don't want to give up my territory and power at all, but in the face of overwhelming force, I am even less willing to risk my life for them." The atmosphere in the hall began to change. Everyone repeated the sentence, including Count Delta. Roland pointed out a few more people, including Delta himself. This time, they all spoke the truth. George began to panic. Had they all been swayed by the new king? It seemed impossible that so many had made contact with Roland without him knowing. Clearly, they had been chosen at random. Roland addressed the group, saying that submitting to power was not a shameful answer. Throughout history, the balance of power has always determined the social hierarchy. Knowing when to adapt was just as important as having courage. He assured them they would receive the same fair treatment as the first group of nobles, but he urged them to remember today and consider the power he wielded. Edith then announced the 4th sentence, "I don't want to give up either side and don't know how to choose." By now, many were sweating profusely, and everyone had changed their mind about the whole thing being a joke. Gaius and George were the most nervous. Roland selected a few more people who spoke the truth, noting that many of them were neutral, but that's okay, given time, they could change their minds. Count Delta interrupted, expressing their belief in Roland's ability to read minds and hoping the exercise would end there. Gaius also laughed nervously, reminding everyone that this was, after all, a banquet. Roland seemed to ignore them and spoke the final sentence himself, capturing what was likely on the minds of the remaining dissenters. "No matter what, I am unwilling to give up my territory and power. For this, I am willing to take risks even if it means toppling the king, which is the only way that my family's wealth and status will be secured." Hearing this, the room fell silent. Roland wasn't in a hurry to get their answers. He simply stated that those who didn't repeat the sentence had no place in their company any longer. Like a true king, he told them that their journey ended there. George couldn't fathom what was happening. Was Roland really going to condemn them without evidence or trial, based on a single sentence? Gaius stood up with his usual smile, saying that if this was a joke, it had gone far enough. The last sentence was too serious for them and none of them dared to say it out loud. He asserted that not everyone felt that way, and he himself would never betray the Wimbledon family. Others quickly agreed. Roland, looking somewhat disappointed, glanced at his wine glass and told them that whatever they wanted to say should be saved for conversations with shovels and stones, as they would be sent to the northern slope mine for 20 years of hard labor for the crime of conspiracy. He was aware that they had been plotting but hadn't acted on their plans yet. Therefore, they were sent to the mines instead of being executed for treason. With that, he downed his glass of wine and slammed the glass onto the floor, ordering his guards to take them into custody. Phyllis and the Takira witches who dressed up as guards drew their swords and began to surround the nobles. George scoffed, thinking Roland underestimated their willingness to resist. Despite having witches around, they had the gods' punishment stones, and these were all nobles and trained knights. George and Gaius exchanged a glance and decided to act. Gaius kicked over the table and shouted that he wouldn't accept such an unjustified trial. With a furious look at Roland, he yelled at Roland that he was asking for it. The other nobles drew their weapons hidden under the table, but Roland just smiled at them. As the strongest among them, Gaius leaped towards one of the guards. They first heard the sound of clashing metal, and soon Gaius felt a sudden chill on his neck. In the next moment, blood splattered everywhere, and half of his sword was embedded in the floor, followed by his head rolling onto the ground. The rest of Roland's guards attacked in unison, and the nobles couldn't even withstand a single blow. George watched in horror as the guards moved with blinding speed, their actions nearly imperceptible to the human eye. He wondered how they trained their bodies to such a level. Seeing this, the remaining nobles knelt, begging for mercy. George realized, perhaps, that Roland had been waiting for this moment all along. This had been a trap from the very start. Recalling Roland's words and the smiles, George finally understood that Roland had been baiting them into action. The nobles dropped their weapons and pleaded with the guards. George, feeling defeated, let his sword fall to his side. He knew it was too late. The moment they had drawn their weapons, they had become traitors in Roland's eyes. Suddenly, he felt a chill on his neck. The last thing he saw was the tilted hall and the corpses of the nobles as his own head hit the ground. Edith wiped the blood from her face, pleased that the plan had worked perfectly. Roland had given her enough trust, and with the help of the witches, everything had gone according to plan. Isabella used her ability to erase the nobles' gods' punishment stones, and then Nightingale used her ability to filter out who was lying and who was telling the truth. Soon, the nobles waiting outside were guided back into the room. Witnessing the gruesome scene, they were terrified and trembling with fear. But Edith still couldn't figure out why Roland had chosen to throw a glass as the signal to act. Suppressing her excitement, she licked her lips, thinking to herself that maybe this was the level of understanding that only a true king can attain. Either way, pledging her loyalty to Roland might have been the best decision she and her family ever made. Yet, what was odd to her was that Roland did not seem pleased. Roland then asked Count Delta if there were any other banquet halls. The Count pointed to the adjacent room. Roland instructed everyone to move there and asked the Count to find someone to list the names of the traitors tonight. Edith realized that perhaps Roland disliked slaughter and killing, making her wonder if her arrangements had been too extreme. Perhaps it would have been better to kill half of them and deal with the rest later. Well, it's too late now. As they moved to the next banquet hall, Roland reassured everyone, telling them that only the traitors would be severely punished. He emphasized the need to restore order and asked for their cooperation, which the nobles all knelt in submission. Roland's first task for them was to consolidate all lands under the kingdom's control and move everyone, including citizens, serfs, and livestock, to Crimson Water City. Count Delta expressed concern, stating that Crimson Water City didn't have enough food or land to support such an influx of people and feared the possibility of famine or revolt. However, Roland told them not to worry. Roland spoke about the second generation of golden wheat from Neverwinter, explaining that its yield was nearly 10 times that of ordinary wheat. Hearing this, everyone was shocked but believed his words. Once the nobles had left, Roland rubbed his temples, feeling a sense of relief at finally taking over Crimson Water City. Next on the list were Silverlight City and the old royal capital. Looking out the window, Roland wondered how the other front was progressing. If there were no unexpected delays, Axe should reach Goldsickle City by tomorrow. He instructed Edith to return to the command center. Once they had the list of traitors, the First Army was to quickly sweep through their territories. Edith hesitated for a moment before nodding in agreement. As she turned to leave, Roland called her back. He praised her for the brilliant strategy she had executed today. She was momentarily taken aback, realizing that she had misinterpreted his feelings. His Majesty didn't mind her actions after all. Bowing to Roland, she left the room. After turning to leave, she suddenly realized her path to power was right on track. The schemes and intrigues that His Majesty did not wish to involve himself in personally. If that's the case, she would then carry out and bear the burden of herself. As Axe approached Goldsickle City, he was puzzled to find that it did not look like the bustling trade city that he had expected. This place was known for trade and was one of the largest cities in Grey Castle. Why did it look so worn down and why were the walls so thick? His adjutant, however, was unconcerned. Since their orders from the king were to pacify the entire eastern region, eliminating any resistance they encountered was their only job. But Axe emphasized that the fighting itself was not the main issue. The real challenge was handling the aftermath and dealing with the rebellious nobles, as Edith had stressed before. Meanwhile, inside the castle, a noble stood before Timothy's painting. He knew this was the moment. Calling his minister over, whose name is Bell, he instructed him to document his words. He declared that Roland, whom he referred to as the King Murderer, and his minions were launching an attack on Goldsickle City after a night's rest. As Duke William Borg, he vowed in the name of the late king to stop the enemy here. His chief knight, Grin Yvain, would stand by his side, her bravery and loyalty beyond question. May the gods protect us, he said, holding the woman beside him close. Turning to Belle, he added with a smile that if Belle found the statement too subjective, he could omit the last sentence. Belle closed his notebook with a smile, remarking that there was no such thing as an entirely objective record. William then took a long sword from the wall and told Belle that his mission was to document everything accurately, regardless of the outcome. As William and Grinna left to join the battle, Belle promised to ensure this piece of history would be remembered. Outside, the battle had already begun. From the city walls, William watched as their trebuchets fired. Next to it was the giant rock cannon. This was their newest weapon, developed using snow powder and a recipe left to him by Timothy. Soon, a giant stone ball was launched from the cannon. He had used up almost all of the iron they had to craft a few of these, which were able to withhold the blast from the snow powder. The giant rock was shot out, then landed and rolled a short distance, carving a shallow dent long in the battlefield, narrowly missing the soldiers of the First Army. William raised his binoculars and saw the enemy crouching down in pairs, with one person placing something into a tube held by the other. In the next moment, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was a cannon, at least that's what he called. Fireballs suddenly burst both inside and outside the city walls. He was astonished at how such a thin tube could withstand the pressure of snow powder explosions. Soon, most of the city walls became engulfed in flames. Soldiers looked to the Duke for guidance, some suggesting surrender while others advocated for a retreat to regroup later. William looked at the girl beside him, who met his gaze simply saying she would follow his lead. Clenching his fists, William ordered them to surrender, but he also wanted to send a message to Roland as he believed that sheer military might would not conquer everything. He wanted to prove that King Timothy had fearless vassals too. William then assembled a group of knights still willing to follow him, donned his helmet, and opened the city gate. Though their numbers were few, they got on their horses and held their weapons. He addressed his men, declaring that while they may have lost today, history would remember their names as legends, sung in ballads and written in poems for generations. He urged his knights to summon their courage and fight fearlessly until the very end. With that, William raised his longsword and charged toward the First Army. The front line of soldiers raised their rifles. However, by the time they were within range, the knights who had followed him were nowhere to be seen. It was just him and Grinna, charging towards the First Army, and soon a barrage of bullets rained down upon them.